We've talked about what's going on in Ukraine and the reasons why this happened, um, both debunking the insane conspiracy theories that people like to posit, and of course the reality of what happened. That this was all part of Vladimir Putin's dream to somehow secure a new glorious empire for Russia, and at least for him try and cement some sort of legacy for him. Um, there was an interesting conversation on the Times a couple of weeks ago. We had a former ambassador to Russia, and one of the interesting things he said is whoever replaces Putin may be in a position or find themselves in a position where he is going to have to let go of those gains that Putin has made in Ukraine. I am very, very much convinced that if Putin takes this territory or takes territory, he's going to find it almost impossible, if not incredibly difficult, to actually control because he's going to have to really, really crack down. He's going to be faced with constant partisan activities, sabotage. These areas are just not going to be as profitable as he hopes. And the hope is that you are seeing all these mass casualties on the Russian side. And the hope is that the Russian people, regardless of how this war shakes out, turn around and just say, what was that all for? And that is still the hope, because obviously, well, they're going to the polls as we speak now, and we all know who was going to win. Like I say, this is, all nicely, stage managed, with a bit of, well, there's Putin, but there's also these other candidates you can vote for. I very much think he's going to win something like around about 75 to 80%. I don't think he's going to sort of unanimously, walk it home, but you can't. You've got to stage manage it in such a way that, Putin won, but, he knows the concerns of the Russian people. He understands, and don't worry, he's going to address them. Meanwhile, of course, he's going to heavily just sort out this special military operation. Yeah, we've got to talk about the fact of this. And one of the things that the maxims that Putin sort of lives by, but it's a very Leninist maxim, is that you probe with bayonets. If you find something that's soft, you advance. If you strike steel, you retreat, and you just keep on probing. And that's what we've seen over the past sort of couple of years. This re-intensifying of Russian aggression, not just through places like Ukraine, but also, but look what happened to sort of Poland, cutting off their natural gas supply and things like that. So it's definitely something we have to, and people should be aware of the consequences of what Putin could do if he wins here. So very, very much, I think, worth going over this and reminding you once again what is at stake in this. So before we do go over to that, please remember to click on the like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below there are links to my Patreon page, the one donation link called Buy Me Coffee. We can all buy me coffee, the YouTube thank you button, and of course, as always, you can always click the like and share button as well. So as always, thank you very much for watching. And thank you very much for watching. Thank you very much to all those people who do help support the channel. And of course, on with this. So this comes from the New European, and it's the consequences of the world would be catastrophic if Putin wins in Ukraine. Ukraine would, of course, be the first place to suffer after a Russian victory, and I absolutely agree with that 100%. Putin's grotesque war crimes in places such as Bucha and Mariupol leave no doubt about a wider occupation of Ukraine would involve. The looting of everything that can be carried off, the destruction of anything that cannot be, mass rape, the kidnappings of thousands of more Ukrainian children, the imprisonment, torture, and murder of everyone who opposes the Russian occupation in any way. And that is the worry. That is the first and foremost worry we should have. What happens to all those Ukrainians who are currently behind that line? Or what if you are a Ukrainian who managed to flee? Do you go back to your home and risk all that? it is going to be a very brutal occupation, a very brutal occupation. I think that is something that people have to understand, that if you allow him to take this territory, it is going to be a very, very brutal occupation. So Putin's autocracy archipelago in Ukraine would be administered by a puppet government installed by Moscow. Its purpose, along with stealing Ukraine's economic assets and kicking back a hefty share to the Kremlin, would be the estimate would eliminate all traces of Ukrainian culture, its identity, in order to prevent it ever resurfacing as a sovereign nation. And that is the other thing at risk as well. That there would be a complete and utter systematic stripping of wealth, um, cultural, societal identification. And bear in mind, I think that is going to be almost next to impossible. One of the things this war has actually done, it has cemented in people's minds and united the Ukrainian people more so than ever. And I think him achieving that cultural and identifying, trying to eliminate that, is going to be next to impossible. But during that time, yeah, he is certainly absolutely going to strip Ukraine of all of its economic assets. Probably again as some sort of war guilt to pay for the war. So the brutality of Moscow's purges would be even more pronounced as it attempts to try and stamp out the inevitable widespread Ukrainian guerrilla resistance. This would be particularly strong and supported by Ukrainian neighbors such as Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, who have all shared a determination never to live under Russia's murderous domain again. Meanwhile, we would also find ourselves watching these horrors unfold while knowing that we could have stopped them from happening only if we had roused ourselves to do so. That is the other worst thing. That if this happens, we would have to look at ourselves knowing all that is happening because we did not act, we did not support Ukraine when they needed it the most. And that is a very, very heavy question and a very, very big burden we in the West will have to bear should this happen. We would also be left now facing a wider war with Russia. One, we would have to fight ourselves rather than leaving the Ukrainians to do it for us. As a parent or a military call-up age kids, I find this terrifying. Putin and his sidekicks have said all along they want to see the war in Ukraine as a proxy battle with NATO and the West, and they have openly threatened to attack NATO next. That is very true. That is something we should be very worried about. Putin's record show that we should take his threats seriously and heed his words of the Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba, saying that every mile Russia advances in Ukraine is a mile closer he gets to you, your towns, and your families. To understand why Putin is likely to launch further attacks on Europe if he's not stopped in Ukraine, we must recognize who he is and what motivates him. Today's Russia does not have a normal government or a normal political culture. In reality, Putin and his cronies are more like a mafia gang formed by rogue KGB secret police who have managed to seize control. As anyone who is an organized crime boss, Putin would know that he cannot afford to lose power. If he did, the many crimes that he's committed and the vast amounts of money that he has stolen from the Russian people would probably leave him to being jailed or killed. This fear drives Putin to eliminate anyone who would challenge him, being a vicious thug and often means murdering them. And we have seen this yet again with the killing of Alexei Navalny, who obviously bravely exposed Putin's criminality. That very same motivation explains Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Ignore all the nonsense of the Putin regime sprouts about the ancient history and the imaginary threats from NATO. What really scared Putin, and this is true, I think this is the most truest thing about this, was the Ukrainian people throwing out their mob-connected, Kremlin-dictated president Viktor Yanukovych in 2014. And of course, Putin fears that Ukraine will succeed in creating a democratic and cleanly run country. He sees this as a very dangerous example of the Russian people might follow, which he might crush before they do. And that is what was also at stake here. Because since 2014, the Ukrainians have been making progress on corruption, on trying to become a more European country. They looked at what has happened from Poland and what they have gone through since throwing off like the communist regime and the fall of the Iron Curtain. They've seen what's happened to Poland and what an economic miracle in many ways Poland has now become, and they have looked at that and gone, why can we not be like that as well? And that is the direction they want to go to. So, ever the paranoid conspiracy theorist, Putin sees the West as somehow being behind the Ukrainian people's quest for freedom. He also regards this as an attempt to overthrow him. As a result, he harbors a very deep-seated grudge against other countries. This anger, combined with his own arrogant sense of superiority, fearful insecurities, and intrinsic power hungriness, is a toxic cocktail that means that there is much about as chance of him stopping unilaterally stopping at Ukraine as there was to Hitler being sated given Czechoslovakia in 1939. After a Ukrainian defeat, the damage that Ukraine has inflicted on Russia's invading armed forces would mean a very short pause before Putin would seek a further advance into Europe. He would probably seek a deal in order to try and buy time to replenish his army. Such a deal would be worthless to us because he is cynically very dishonest, and Putin breaks almost every agreement he makes. That is right. Over 20 different separate peace agreements involved in this. Even before the actual invasion of Ukraine, he has broken them all, lock, stock, and barrel. Russia's economy has already been transformed into a wartime one, dedicated to weapons and production. While it is continued with this effort, Putin would be able to count on us complacently now going back to our domestic political disputes while failing to prepare in the same way. He would then attack again. In their very public threats, Putin and his cronies make no secrets of their targets for Russia's next attack after Ukraine. These include Poland, the Baltic states, and primarily places such as the city of Novara in Estonia, which are very near to the Russian frontier and have huge numbers of Russian speakers, like the Suwalki Gap, which now forms the border between Poland and Lithuania. And this is the danger. This is the continuing danger, and this is everyone has been since day one of this invasion, because the very same reasoning that Putin used to take those countries applies to a lot of other countries as well on the border, and they are worried about that, and they have every right to be worried about that continuously. They have been the ones that joined NATO. The whole reasoning to prepare for this that they eventually suspected would be a return. So seizing this control of this gap would sever the land bridge connection between the Baltic states and the rest of NATO. A Russian attack on the Baltic Sea coast of Romania and Bulgaria is also another possibility. If the West promise to stand with Ukraine is shown to be an empty one, it would severely undermine NATO's deterrence and effect on Russia, in which European security relies. If we fail to respond fully to a Ukrainian attack on a fellow member state, NATO will have become obsolete. And that is true. And of course, he gets on here talking about Donald Trump, which I always keep on telling you. Donald Trump has undermined, if he wins, he has already undermined the idea of collective defense and coming to another country's, or at least another NATO country's defense, should Article 5 be triggered. Donald Trump has already damaged NATO's deterrent effect, saying that he would encourage Russia to do whatever the hell they want to some member states. Putin will be slavering at that prospect of Trump returning to power. The consequences of a Russian invasion into a NATO country would be disastrous for the US. Failing to meet its commitments with its closest allies would ruin its credibility as a global force. With grim irony, it would render it more like Russia, a spent former superpower raging at its lost status. China would also be watching very closely. If the US and Europe are unable to assist Ukraine in fending off Russia, then Beijing would conclude they are unlikely to defend a very distant Taiwan. China will see this as a green light to attack Taiwan at a time of its own choosing. Another thing that everyone has brought up in about this, that China is watching this very, very closely. Very, very closely indeed. As well as all that, the violent upheaval, a Russian victory in Ukraine would have other very disastrous consequences. In Europe, with economies reeling and steep increase in defense spending still needed to defend against any further Russian advances, would largely come at the expense of already stretched budgets, public services as healthcare and education. A further strain on resources would cause a massive influx of millions of Ukrainian refugees desperately fleeing life under Putin's boot. Also something we would see as well, a mass exodus. We would absolutely see a mass exodus. This is something I think would happen. And I think whatever territory Putin keeps, you are going to see something like that in some way, shape, or form. It's one of the reasons why many people think that Putin has kidnapped all these kids, because he wants to keep their parents there. So we'll see. This would also play in the hands of the Europe's rising far-right parties, many of which already favour collaboration with Putin rather than trying to resist him. They would also work closely with Russia to stoke any sense of democratic liberalism, has failed to seize on the opportunity to install authoritarianism. That is also very true as well. This would be seen as a massive victory for many of those far-right parties, and we could see an even further entrenching of those far-right parties into many of European democracies. In the US, the Trumpist Republicans would follow a very similar path, with the potential for failing as a fading, frustrated superpower led by an unstable extremist to lash out in all manner of unpredictable ways. That is something to consider as well. How would they react in that, and in what ways would they lash out? That's a very fair point. I think that's a valid, very, very valid one to make. And then this is the other one. The food price, and the fact that these two countries, remember, Russia and Ukraine provide 20 to 30% of the world's grain. Putin would have control of that. This would make him very, very volatile. And look, if Putin is, been willing to mess with energy in the past to try and get his way, he is more than willing to use grain in the same way. Remember, all these farmer protests. Why is that? Because this year, we don't know why. Well, why? I think Putin's trying to test things. A lot of these farmer protests are complaining about the price of grain. This isn't Ukrainian grain they're complaining about, although that's what many of these farmers are saying. But again, it's the far right here trying to say that it's Ukrainian grain, but it's actually not. It's Russian grain, because he has flooded the EU markets with this grain. That is a problem. It has caused these protests very, very much so. He is going to do that, absolutely, and it is going to have some very, very wide-ranging consequences on countries that are also not in Europe as well. So globally, the first year of Russia's war in Ukraine showed the dangers of food price inflation caused by a shortage of grain supplies. The two countries that supply around 20-30% of the world's total. This led to famine or even political instability in the most fragile parts of the Middle East and Africa. In particular, this also threatened to promote very severe social unrest in more stable regional linchpin nations like Egypt and Kenya. So imagine that if Putin now has control of Egypt, which has control of one of the most strategic shipping lanes in the world. Imagine what Putin might do if he has that lever to pull of the grain imports that he might be able to put onto Egypt to maybe slow things down going through the Suez Canal. There's all sorts of stuff he could very much pull there. Kenya, another one. Hey, let Wagner forces into Kenya. He might do that, and then of course we've seen what Wagner forces have done, or at least the Africa Corps, as they're now called, have done in the past in these various African countries, looting, pillaging, all kinds of stuff. That threat would be there for the Wagner for this Africa Corps troops. It'd be very, very worrying. So a Russian victory in Ukraine would also give Putin a permanent control over huge amounts of the world's grain and foodstuffs. And that is, I think, yeah, if not, should give you pause for thought about what is going on in Ukraine, and of course the consequences of what would happen should a Russian victory happen. So yeah, we will see. But of course, obviously, you should be bearing those consequences in mind. And of course, as I've said before, to many of the peace, people who want peace in Ukraine, what about these consequences? How do we make sure that these consequences do not come to pass? What should we do? They don't have an answer. Very often they'll just, ceasefire, and then magic peace will happen. It's not going to be that simple, especially when it comes to Ukraine. And there's a lot of people very naively thinking that will just be the case. It should not. You need to bear the consequences of what would happen in and around the world and the global consequences for what would happen if Putin does win in Ukraine. So you need to bear that in mind, and it's something you should always be in the back of your mind thinking about. So, as always, until next time, we'll see you all very soon.